We should know how these algorithms work in society. Show me the algorithms.
I accept the premise that like most Americans are troubled by Biden's age. I think there's even polls to suggest that this is the number one worry of Democrats. Personally,
do you think it is wrong to surgically remove the breasts of a 13-year-old girl for the purposes of gender or sex reassignment surgery? Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to what I am going to call the Centrist War Room. As many of you know, the online political space is rapidly gaining influence as traditional media continues to fade into irrelevancy. For example, just a few days ago, several high-profile online political figures, including Destiny, Vosh, and Emma Vigeland, traveled to Washington, D.C. under the organizational leadership of one Brianna Wu to interview the congressional representative from California's 17th District, Ro Khanna. This was an active attempt to engage the growing number of young voters in the United States, whose primary vector of interaction with politics is through online mediums like YouTube and Twitch. This, in my opinion, is a genuinely exciting transformation of the modern political landscape that we are about to witness. And while I am glad that my fellow internet micro-celebrities are making strides IRL, the truth is there is only one internet micro-celebrity that I trust to represent the will of the silent majority. Me. And that is why, on the eve of October 1st, I picked up the phone and called my most trusted assistant from the frozen frontier lands of Canada, and I said, "Assistant, the time has come. Gather your forces and meet me in the scorching city of Dallas, Texas, for we have a war to plan." And that is what we were about to do. Before we engage in one of our classic debates about globalism versus nationalism and culture war issues, I want to start with this. I have put together a list of several policies I believe most reasonable people on the left and right would not only support, but could actively rally behind as a common sense political platform. And I am to discuss these potential policies, excuse me, and I am to discuss these potential policies with none other than noted Canadian refugee and PF Young orbiter, JJ McCullough. JJ, welcome to the Centrist War Room.
thanks for having me. I somewhat resent that characterization.
Yes.
I like to think that you're my orbiter.
My number one assistant? That's fair. Before we begin, before we engage in some of our classic banter, I would like to know, there's been a lot of interesting stuff going on in Canada.
Indeed there has.
Yes. How did you feel about the Canadian government giving a standing ovation to a literal Nazi?
Yeah. It was pretty funny, actually.
Take it away.
Phrase literal Nazi was trending on Canadian Twitter for a while.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a sort of appalling, embarrassing incident. So basically what happened was that the Speaker of the Canadian Parliament, so President Zelensky was in Canada and he was giving a speech to the sort of assembled Canadian Parliament. And the Speaker of the House has a tradition of inviting guests when sort of VIPs are in town. And the Speaker invited, this 98-year-old man from his district. And he sort of said, "Oh, this is like a brave man who fought for the Ukrainians in the Second World War."
Decorated war hero.
He fought against the Russians in the Second World War, which the Speaker said very openly. And that really should have set off some alarm bells for anybody who knows anything about even like very basic facts about World War II.
Yeah.
If you're fighting against the Russians, whose side were you on? It wasn't Canada's side.
Right.
But anyway, sort of, I'm sensitive to the politicians because it's like in the heat of the moment, you're told that, oh, there's this great war veteran and let's all give him some applause. And so everybody stands up. And of course, it didn't take long for the fact checkers to reveal that this guy, by virtue of fighting against the Russians, he was part of a sort of Ukrainian sort of puppet army that was allied with the Nazis and in fact actively under Nazi direct command. And so the Speaker of the House had to resign in shame over this.
Oh, did he really?
Yeah, he did.
How long was he Speaker for?
He was Speaker for several years. Yeah, Anthony Rota.
Wow.
So
I didn't
actually,
know that.
in a very funny and very like idiosyncratic sort of Canadian twist, when the Speaker of the House resigns, the longest serving member of Parliament becomes the new Speaker. Okay. And it just so turns out that the longest serving member of Parliament is a Quebec separatist. So now we have a Quebec separatist as the Speaker of the House. So
nice.
Canada's sort of gotten its comeuppance in that
When
way.
does the new Speaker take over?
Just in a couple of days. Like there will be a
Will be an election?
There'll be an election for a new Speaker.
I see.
Yeah. But anyway, but it was in, there's a bigger dimension to this story as well, because obviously a lot of sort of Jewish groups have been upset about this, as they should be. And, the Eastern European governments have been upset. And the Ukrainians are upset too, because obviously this was one of the great sort of lines that the Russians had been using, that the Ukrainians are a bunch of
not all of
Nazis
the Ukrainians were upset, given some people in Ukraine, and a non-insignificant minority, happen to have sympathetic views towards said decorated war hero.
Well, you're right, actually, and there has been some discourse about this because sort of the Canadian, so Canada has a pretty substantial Ukrainian-Canadian population. It's pretty significant, and it's pretty politically powerful in some ways. And there has been, in the aftermath of this incident, some sort of tough questions being asked about the degree that the Ukrainian-Canadian community has, in fact, sort of whitewashed that country's history during the Second World War, and to what extent, like the whitewashing of Ukraine's past during the Second World War, and specifically some of the people who emigrated to Canada after the war and, created communities for Ukrainian Canadians and so forth, to what extent are they in any way sort of culpable for some of the ammunition that the Russians have used against the Ukrainians in this current war and in this current controversy specifically?
It is an interesting way to phrase that. To what extent are they responsible for giving the Russians ammunition? Meaning, to what degree are they actually Nazis?
No, because
the Russians accurately describe them as Nazis.
Well, I mean, it's significant in the sense that, like, if the Ukrainians, or at least this faction of Ukrainian Canadians who sort of came to Canada after the war and, had a certain spin on what their country did during the Second World War, if they had maybe been a little bit more honest with, their culpability and sort of atoned for it and said, look, this was a chapter of our history we're not proud of and this kind of thing, then, it would be, I think, easier to be in a healthy place, right? In the way that the Germans, atoned for their guilt. But instead, the Ukrainian Canadians, in many cases, they whitewash that history. And there's even like controversial monuments in sort of Ukraine-heavy parts of Canada that are like tributes to soldiers who fought on the Nazi side during the war. And this has been obviously a big source of tension with the Jewish community in Canada. So again, if they had handled this differently, if they hadn't been quite so defensive, maybe we'd be in a healthier place and maybe the speaker would still have his job.
Yeah, that's fair. And to be honest, I know it makes for good memes that the Canadian government literally, gave a standing ovation to the Nazis.
Yes.
But, okay, it's pretty clear. You said the speaker resigned. I didn't even know. It's like, okay, clearly they know they screwed up. So, Matt Walsh and crew will make their way with those memes. But
well, I mean, it's interesting.
I don't think it's evidence that the Canadian government are sympathetic to Nazis.
No, I mean, it was a huge scandal.
Because they are clearly sympathetic to communism. But that's a separate issue. Okay, well, let's get to some policies. What do you say, JJ?
Sounds good.
All right. So I have a number of policies here that I think could serve as, the common sense, centrist, although centrist has, some baggage. Understood. Fair enough. But these are ranked, in my opinion, in order of most practical to most aspiring, right? So something, the first one we'll go to is one that I think could be done relatively soon.
Okay, hold on.
And then one's aspirational. Go ahead.
I want to ask sort of a framing question of, so like,
please do.
This is sort of based on the premise in a very sort of classically sort of centrist Andrew Yang-y sort of way.
Yes.
Is the premise that these are policies that most Americans would support, or are these policies that sort of the existing sort of two-party duopoly would prevent from emerging?
I think they're policies that most people would support. For example, I'm almost hesitant to get your reaction to this because there's a chance that you might just go full establishment.
I'm just curious. I'm curious if you're leading with transphobia or we're leading up to transphobia.
Okay, all right. We will talk about that, and I think you are abetting transphobia by throwing that label around inappropriately. Okay. Number one, ranked choice voting.
Ranked choice voting.
This would be a straightforward, easily implementable challenge to the two-party duopoly.
Yes.
Which I think is a common point of consensus between sort of the populist left and the populist right.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that that's sort of something that Americans who imagine themselves to be centrists bitch about a lot, which is the idea of like the two-party system, blah, 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 right?
Right, which I think you might actually be better at explaining ranked choice voting than I am. You want to give it a attempt? Because the number one criticism, the only valid criticism I've heard of it is that it's relatively complex.
It is complex. And I mean, like, there's been referendums in Canada asking us if we want to have it. And every time there's a and I think there's been referendums about it in America as well.
And some states, I think, have adopted it.
I think Alaska has it, but not many states do, in part because it tends to get voted down because it's complicated, right? But I mean, ranked choice voting is basically the premise is that instead of just putting a single check mark beside the candidate you want, you rank all of the candidates 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in your order of preference. And then they do some sort of complex mathematical calculation in which they determine who was the highest ranked in a sort of they do the arithmetic to determine.
It's not that complex. I mean, it is. I don't think it's that complex. We'll edit an infographic on from some ranked choice voting advocate that'll make it clear. But it's basically like, instead of having to pick Donald Trump or Joe Biden, you can say, okay, if it maybe I want Nikki Haley. Yeah. Or maybe I want RFK Jr. or Bernie Sanders, something like that. But I don't want to waste my vote. Maybe I'm pro Bernie Sanders, but I don't want to I don't want to cause my vote for Bernie Sanders to hand the election over to Donald Trump. Yeah. Right? So ranked choice voting is saying, well, my first choice would be Bernie Sanders, but if he doesn't win, if he doesn't get the majority of the first round of voting, then my second choice will be Joe Biden. It'll go to, and then basically it eliminates wasted votes for third parties or kind of lesser popular candidates that the two-party duopoly supports. That I have seen is a very common consensus line between the left and the right.
It's worth noting that I feel like in an American context, this is an idea that's usually proposed as an alternative to having primaries, right? So it's like instead of having a primary for the Republicans and a primary for the Democrats, instead of having these two separate elections that then sort of culminate in this like big battle royale one-on-one election, you just kind of have one election in which everybody runs at the same time. I think actually California is doing this because now that the Senate seat is vacant, I believe this is the system that they use for electing their new senator. Because then what could happen is that you could basically have like the top two candidates could be Democrat versus Democrat or Democrat.
Right.
Or Republican versus Republican or whatever, right? So
do you support it? Do you like ranked choice voting?
I mean,
other than it's complicated, which I would say the fact that it is able to be implemented in a place like California or Alaska is evidence that however complex it is, it's not overly complex to the point where it's not feasible to implement.
I mean, I think the complication factor is a worthy ding on it, right? I think people want to know how their votes work. And I think one of the problems as well is that there already kind of is a form of this in many states, and that's just having a runoff election, right? Like what? And I've never heard a good argument of like why we can't just do more runoff elections. Like lots of states have runoff elections if someone doesn't get, because that's the other thing too, right?
Kanye West is never going to win a runoff election, but he could win a ranked choice voting election.
Yeah, actually, I mean, ranked choice voting, like I've read a fair bit about this because obviously it's been a lively debate in Canada, and there are like some weird deformations that can happen. Like ranked choice voting outcomes can be very counterintuitive in some ways, because like the amount of like being everybody's second choice in some cases can be more desirable in being anybody's first choice.
Yeah.
Which sort of provokes a kind of like odd strategy in some ways where it's like you want to be popular but not too popular, and in fact there's even like contexts in which if you become too popular you could get punished,
where
right?
Depending on what round it is or something like that, if you don't have the plurality, then you're better off in
it's
second
also
place, I guess.
It's also sort of based on a premise that like you're just supposed to accept the outcome as being in tune with your preferences, right? So like if you and I are having a debate over, what kind of ice cream we want to have, and you say, well, I would like chocolate, vanilla, or strawberry, and then I say, well, rank all the other types of ice creams as well, and then fine, you do, and then the outcome winds up being, okay, you're having pistachio.
Yeah, but you don't have to do that. You can still pick one.
No, but here, my point is that like if you wind up having pistachio ice cream, and it's like, well, this was pretty low on my choice of ice creams I'd like to have, and it's like, well, you still ranked it, so in theory you like pistachio better than maple walnut, so you have to be satisfied, right?
I guess it seems to me it could just be, hey, list your candidates in order of preference. Like maybe I like RFK Jr. because I don't like Trump, but I don't want to vote for RFK Jr. because it's going to take away a vote from Biden that would allow Trump to get elected.
Yes.
So it could just be RFK Jr. then Biden, and you don't even include, you don't put Trump on the list at all.
Yeah,
that seems like a valid, but you're not totally against it. You could be convinced.
I mean, I think, again, like, I just kind of like runoff voting. Like, I feel like runoff voting has the same principle because to me, the most sort of the most important principle that I think democratic elections should have in order to have public legitimacy is I think somebody should get more than 50% of the vote. Like, I think that is very important. And I think that a runoff election is a very easy way to get more than 50% of the vote. I think, like, in theory, you win a ranked choice vote with more than 50% of the vote, but how you get to that more than 50% of the vote is very convoluted, and I feel it's not intuitively.
Got it. Well, the centrist policy wonks that we will soon be employing will work out what the best way to do that is to avoid complexity like that. Let's move on to policy number 2.
Okay.
I mentioned this earlier. Expanded adoption of nuclear energy.
Yeah.
Right, the climate change issue I feel,
Yes.
is essentially a religious one.
Yes.
Meaning the two sides are so dug in. People have not arrived at their perspective on the basis of empirical analysis. Most people who believe in climate change,
Yes.
including myself, have never read a study that says climate change is happening.
Yes.
I just trust people that are more intelligent
Yes.
than me.
Yes.
I trust their opinions, which is how almost all of our knowledge in every area of life is
Yes.
derived.
Especially scientific realms.
Yeah, exactly. We're in medicine and all that stuff.
Yes.
So it seems to me that the solution has to be one that cuts across two different conversations.
Yes.
Right? Because on the one hand, it's, well, climate change is, a lot of people on the right are skeptical of the degree to which humans contribute to climate change.
I think some on the right are just skeptical that it's happening at all in any form.
That's true, but I think the charitable and more reasonable interpretation of the right-wing perspective is, for a given single degree change in the global temperature, we don't know what percent of that change was human caused versus natural.
Yes.
Could be 5%, could be 10, could be 30, could be 50, could be 80. But as far as I know, there's no consensus about the degree to which a single degree change is caused by humans. Right?
And
but there's enough that it's a problem worth addressing, which is why nuclear energy, I think, is the solution, because it speaks to the left's concern about greenhouse gas emission, and it speaks to the right's concern about energy independence and having a energy source that is not dependent on, like importing oil from, other countries or whatnot, right? Which we learned in COVID, we're very susceptible to supply shocks, and we're dependent on other countries. So it's like, well,
we're less dependent on foreign oil than we've ever been in the past, right?
True.
And
true.
I'm
just saying, speaking broadly, it seems like nuclear energy would be the perfect practical policy solution that speaks across both conversations. And it's one that the opposition to nuclear energy, I don't think, is that compelling. Yeah. But you might think otherwise.
No. I mean, I'm like broadly for nuclear energy, and I think most Americans are broadly for it.
What do you think the arguments against it are?
The arguments against it are just that, there's a risk of terrible nuclear disasters like Fukushima that we saw in Japan. I think that the issue of the radioactive waste that nuclear energy produces has never really been addressed. Like the idea you just have to find some mine somewhere and just bury all of the radioactive material. I think that is something that troubles a lot of people.
But we do that now. We have there's a mountain range somewhere.
I know, but the question is just how many more of these kinds of things do we want? Like if we had nuclear energy at a really expansive level, then there'd be a lot more nuclear sort of waste that would have to be.
I don't believe waste disposal is even remotely. I could be wrong, but I believe we have the amount of waste that's produced is virtually minimal given the infrastructure we have to store it. The main issue that people bring up is risk of meltdown or whatnot. And my understanding is modern nuclear reactor technology is basic. Is you're far more likely to have health concerns living around a natural gas power plant than you are a nuclear power plant.
No, and I agree that. I think that a lot of the fears of nuclear energy are quite dated. We kind of had a debate about nuclear energy in the 1980s. This is where the Simpsons kind of memes and all that, the idea oh, Mr. Burns owns a nuclear power plant. Could you imagine something so wicked, right?
Or Chernobyl recently.
Yeah, but it was bound up in the Cold War, and there was nuclear disasters. It was also associated with nuclear weapons, and then so it kind of got tainted by association in that kind of way. So there's a kind of sense that there was a consensus on nuclear energy that was established in the 80s, and we haven't really re-examined it since then. And I think that why this is an interesting policy is that it also, in some ways, it's a true centrist policy in that it's an idea that doesn't have a natural constituency in the existing two-party system. Mm-hmm. I mean, even though that you sort of made the case that you can pitch it to both right and left, which I think is true, part of the reason why I think it's not a bigger part of the debate today is because neither right nor left is really interested in sort of pushing it forward, right? The left,
which is goofy.
No, I agree. The left still is sensitive to, I think, some of the more kind of hippy-dippy sort of parts of the coalition that are just kind of instinctively allergic to the idea of nuclear energy because, they have memories of these debates from the 1980s and all of that. And then there's, a significant faction of the right that just does not want to concede that America's energy policies have to change in any way, right? They're just like oil is great. And, they're committed to oil in a kind of like cultural signifier sort of way.
Yeah.
And so to even have
Vivek Ramaswamy says fossil fuels are essential for human flourishing.
Yeah,
Of course there is some truth to that.
Of course. I mean, our society.
But it seems like we should, but it seems like why rely on, like nuclear can be run at all times. It's not susceptible to supply shock.
The problem though for the right wing is just that, like, it's difficult to imagine how they pitch it to their base, because it seems like in order to pitch it, particularly at a time when America is so energy independent, right? Like this is not, in the early 2000s or something where we're having all these debates about our reliance on the Middle East for the oil and that kind of stuff. Maybe there was a moment there, but today with America being energy independent, with the fracking revolution and all that kind of stuff, the only reason why you would have the conversation about exploring an alternate form of energy would be in the climate change way. And I just think that a lot of Republicans are a little allergic to even going down that rhetorical path.
That's why you need a non-cringy left-wing nerd to advocate for it. You need a enlightened-based charismatic centrist. Okay. Now, we've had a very cordial conversation so far.
Of course.
JJ.
Yes.
But I've got 2 more policies that I think you're going to cry about, although I believe this is genuine.
Yeah.
This is radical centrism.
Okay.
This is great stuff.
All right.
Nobody's got better radical centrist policies than I do.
Of course.
Okay, here's policy number 3.
Yeah.
Algorithmic transparency.
Okay.
Meaning, I think a platform to run on is whoever it is, a congressperson, whoever the Chad centrist, based Enlightened centrist is running, should push for the usage of executive orders, advocating for executive orders to force social media companies to make their algorithms transparent, like Twitter does. Okay? And this is the analogy. So if a pharmaceutical company developed a virus that got released on to society, which has never happened, of course, we would not tolerate them saying, oh, well, we're not going to release the genetic code because it's proprietary, corporate, private property, whatever. It's like, hold on. You created something that has enough negative externalities that it is the public's right to understand how that virus works.
Yes.
And I would say that social media algorithms are a mimetic virus, a cultural virus, in that they've absolutely had consequences on elections. They absolutely affect people's mental health.
Yes.
And it seems to me that justifies, what would you say? Stomping over the property rights of these megacorporations, which I wouldn't even regard as, I wouldn't say asking the pharmaceutical company to release the genetic code of the virus they created. That's not stomping on their property rights. I think we should do the same thing with social media companies. And Twitter does that already.
Yeah.
So it's like the argument, well, it'll destroy shareholder value. It'll destroy, their competitive advantage. It's like, well, it's a utilitarian argument at that point where, you know what? I think we need to know what these algorithms are doing, how people are not just, suppressed or whatnot, but like, what is there a pipeline to the alt-right, whatever. Whatever, we should know how these algorithms work in society. Show me the algorithms.
Yeah.
Okay?
No, I think it's a fair argument, and I think there's actually a less sensationalistic analogy that I would make, which is that
Wouldn't land, gotta be sensationalistic.
Which is that, like when you go to McDonald's, they always have that sort of sad little
food
rack
label
where you can like get those little brochures that tell you how many calories and all that kind of, and the food labels. The fellow that invented the food labels just passed away recently. The guy who designed that little black and white thing on the side of the cereal boxes that we all look at, right? Like, and that's the result, from what I understand, that's the result of congressional legislation, in the name of public health.
Totally.
They require food manufacturers to let you know what you're consuming, what's in the food. Right.
As someone who is allergic to peanuts, tree nuts, sesame seeds, and peas, I'm embarrassed to say it's a type of legume. Don't ask. I think it should be a law that if you own a restaurant, everything on your menu you should have to list the top 10 major allergens.
Yes.
I believe that's what they do in Europe. The last time I went, every menu that they had, it told you all the major allergens. It's like, yes. Be transparent. Require transparency. Don't tell people how to operate per se, but require transparency.
California, as anybody who's been to that state knows, have all these signs everywhere saying that you're entering a premise that contains chemicals that are known by the state of California to be
which you could say, that like dumbs people down, and I get that. But But what do you think? What do you think of executive order?
Yeah.
President
Well, I don't think it has to
Chad
be,
centrist centerman
yeah.
on day one says, I'm issuing an executive order. All major social media companies, which we will list by name, are required to make their algorithms transparent.
Well, I mean, I'm not a big
challenge
fan of,
that.
I'm not a big fan of making policy through executive order. I mean, this is not a monarchy, right?
Yeah,
Congress should do it. But I mean, like, I think you make a persuasive case, like, in the name of sort of public health and sort of the general welfare, as the Constitution puts it. I think that there is perhaps a case to be made for this kind of thing, and I think that, you know, as our sort of understanding of technology progresses, and as we sort of understand technology to not just sort of be a kind of neutral thing, but something that actually has consequences, including health consequences, I think it logically follows that there should be some degree of regulation in the same sort of way. And I think it is, I mean, I think it's common sense, but I also do wonder, like, if you're talking about like platforms and this kind of thing, I don't think that this is necessarily an issue that resonates that broadly with the public. I think it resonates.
Really?
Yeah.
I think going after big tech resonates widely with the populist right and the populist left.
I think, well, I mean, going after big tech maybe does, right? But I think that
that's what that is.
Yeah.
Show me the algorithm.
Maybe you're right. And maybe like when food labeling was being a thing, it was probably pitched in a kind of antagonistic way.
Yeah, I don't know about food labeling, but
it probably was. Like, I mean, I'm not that old, but I can remember that there was like a lot of controversy about like the idea that you know, advertising was very dishonest and that companies were like, you know, putting toothpaste on the cupcakes to make it look more delicious than it was, and all of this kind of thing, right?
Gross. I would also make, and I'd also point out, you know, people would say, oh, well, it's unconstitutional. You know, you have all these cringe libertarians, you know, who are all about don't touch my property rights, the government should be abolished, all that stuff, all that nonsense. Well, they'll say, but, you know, that violates property rights. And again, it's like, with the pharmaceutical analogy, I think it's very clear that it would not be a violation of property rights, or at least the positive benefits of that would so outweigh the violation of property rights that it would be worth it. And I'd also point out historically, like I said, I asked ChatGPT about which presidents in the past have violated the Constitution in ways that, you know, we regard as maybe having been the right thing. Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, according to ChatGPT.
You're so close to making just defensible positions. You don't always have to shake it up with so much
hold on.
kookery.
My point broadly is that just because there are reasonable legal challenges to a executive order that would require
I don't think it has to be
social media company to do that.
Why can't Congress just do this?
Because they're too slow. And fair enough. I mean, obviously, I'd be happy with a congressional law.
Yeah.
But I would sort of advocate, like, you know what? No, in times, the risks are so great with social media.
Yeah.
And not just at like a societal level with election stuff. I mean, like at mental health level type stuff.
Yeah.
Like, I think that would warrant executive action. And that's the radical part of the radical centrist platform.
the problem,
right?
Radical,
the enlightened radical centrist.
No, I think Congress could
We're gonna have to work on the marketing because radical centrist doesn't land as much. But what do you think? Is that fair?
I think if Congress did it, and I think it could get buy-in because like Republicans will sort of bend their principles when it comes to sort of government regulation of business when they don't care for the business,
right? Which Democrats never do. But
and
I would also say it'd be a lot more difficult to pass it in Congress because a lot of you only need a few congressmen to be bought by big tech. You only need one president to issue an executive order.
Well, I don't think we should go down the path of viewing that as the best way to make public policy.
Perhaps. Okay.
All right,
this one's really going to make you cry.
What's next?
I believe.
Okay.
So I said ranked choice voting.
Yep.
Nuclear energy.
Okay.
Algorithmic transparency.
Yep.
And then this is the fourth policy I have.
Okay.
And I think this one this is the most aspirational. It'd be the most long-term project. It'd be the hardest one to put into practice. But I do think it probably would be it'd have the furthest reaching positive consequences.
Okay.
Mandatory civil service. We've discussed this previously.
Okay.
I think on the day you turn 18, you should be required to spend 1 year, 2 years, 24 months, some combination of time, as part of the civil service doing work in underserved communities, disaster response and preparedness, conservation work, et cetera. A lot of what the National Guard will do or other, sort of like AmeriCorps and all that.
Yeah.
And this would be, number one, a way for every person, regardless of class, regardless of income, regardless of background, to come together with their fellow citizens across every walk of life, independent of how much money their parents have or independent of their educational background, to, do basic boots on the ground work that actually makes a difference in the places that need it most, right? So I think that would foster a sense of unity that we are severely lacking in our increasingly isolated era, certainly in part perpetrated by our social media algorithms. And this is people, I think I saw a comment in our previous discussion. Someone said, I can't think of anything more evil than forced labor.
Yeah.
Which is like, first off, Switzerland, South Korea, Israel are just 3 of many countries that have mandatory military service.
Yeah.
And I believe it's for more than 2 years for some of them. And so there's just a practical element that is already happening and it could be implemented here, obviously larger scale. But I think there's a deeper moral argument to be made, which is this idea of freedom versus responsibility, right? Our rights and our freedoms, we assume that we're just entitled to them, right? When I feel like everyone knows that freedoms have to be fought for and maintained. And there's the Jordan Peterson line, which is your rights are my responsibilities, right? In order for you to have rights, I have to be responsible for at least maintaining the social structures that enforce those rights, right? Through, active participation in the community, or at least maintenance of the community, being a contributing member of society. And to me, that's actually a sort of a left-wing, a positive left-wing perspective of, like, individual rights and freedoms are very obsessed about by libertarians and kind of the classic right wing, I guess you might say. But, we're a social species. We're part of a community. And this civil service is like, it's the minimum you can do. 2 years of your life. Yeah. And then you have all the rights that you would as a regular citizen. Yeah. And Viktor Frankl, who he wrote the book Man's Search for Meaning. He was he was a psychiatrist, I believe, Austrian psychiatrist. Okay. In the concentration camps. Yes. And he's influenced me a lot. His theory, or you can sum up his theory. He says the Statue of Liberty should be supplemented by a Statue of Responsibility on the West Coast, because you have to have both. Yeah. Because if you just assume that your liberties are our parents or whoever, our forefathers or ancestors, whatever, fought for those. Yeah. Well, they'll just be maintained for the rest of time. Yeah. And I think no. I think that we have a responsibility to participate and contribute to the communities that facilitate those individual rights. So mandatory civil service, JJ.
Okay.
Centrist policy number 4.
I mean, this is definitely a thing that a certain sort of centrist intellectual will reliably push
for. Based, intelligent, centrist.
I mean, I think that this has obvious constitutional problems, but beyond that, I would ask, so what problem is this solving exactly?
Polarization, isolation. It's solving the problem that, well, first off, you can solve very practical problems. If you have healthy civil service at any times, I mean, you have disaster preparedness, you have even just like environmental cleanup work in like underprivileged cities. I mean, I lived in Chicago for a bit of time. Like, there's no shortage of places that it would just like, man, if just 100 people just came through and just cleaned up and just picked up garbage. Do you think the reason
it's not being cleaned up is because of a lack of manpower to do it?
I think if there was more manpower available that had to be on, retainer at all times for a state, which is like what the National Guard is. Yeah. And it was a norm for that to be utilized, I think that would be a very productive use of that.
I think, so I was in Israel, and this was obviously, it's a big part of their culture to do the mandatory military service. You can weasel out of it, but it's very difficult to. And if you do, you're very sort of shamed by society for the rest of your life.
Which is how it should be here.
And
doesn't matter how rich your parents are.
Yeah, yeah. No. So it is a great equalizer in that sense. But at the same time, I think it's very difficult to look at, say, modern Israel and say, oh, here's a society with no polarization. Here's a society where everybody gets along and they have no contentious debates.
Yes.
And same with
I would not suggest that this would solve all of our problems.
No, I mean, I
think Israel would be probably worse off if it did not have it.
I don't know. I would just sort of say that there seems to be like zero correlation. South Korea has very viciously polarized politics, very much like America, very sort of right versus left. They can't get anything done in their Congress these days because of how intense the polarization is, despite the fact that even, top Korean pop stars have to do mandatory military service. I mean, that's kind of...
As they should.
No, and it's like, it's charming.
Harry Styles needs to be on the front line.
Well, I mean, he's not an American, but It is like in that sense, it is
spends a lot of time in America. Though. No, I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
It is like I think there's something kind of like aspiring and egalitarian when you see like a Korean pop star having in the same way like you remember when like Elvis had to do mandatory service back when America had the draft. Yeah,
that's fun.
And that was like a sort of thing, right? And when Muhammad Ali was drafted and he refused to serve, that was seen as this great sort of offense to the civic culture. It doesn't have to be
military, to be clear.
No. But what I'm sort of saying is that there is like it has an egalitarian appeal. Like the idea that just as we all have to pay our taxes, we all have to do our service as well. But at the same time, like I do think that this would almost certainly be unconstitutional. I feel like there would have to be so many exemptions sort of carved into it, and that so many Americans would just find ways to weasel out of it. It's kind of like jury duty,
right? I mean, you have to. I know. And look, this is but the first iteration of the centrist war room. Okay, we have many years ahead of us to iron out this policy in a way that could actually be implemented.
Would you get paid while you do it?
No, I'm not materialist. I'm an empath. I only need
well, I'm just curious because like,
I only
assume
need the appreciation of those who I serve, which is my fellow Americans.
Because I mean, it could potentially be very expensive as well.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, it'd be an incredibly logistically difficult thing. So, but you know, I mean, we've done many difficult things. The interstate, we were talking about the interstate over here. It's like that was a very ambitious project, and it was a very physical one in terms of all the infrastructure that needed to be built out. So. I agree it would be very difficult to get people to buy in, and there is, but I do think it appeals to the sensibilities of the right in terms of responsibility. Like, you need to get a job and contribute to society. It's a very kind of classically right-wing perspective.
Yeah.
But it also appeals to the left-wing sensibilities of you're not just some individual isolated from everything. You're part of a community. Right? You have fellow citizens, and
no, I definitely think it has a pitch, and it's definitely the sort of thing that I could imagine a centrist candidate running on. Right. I mean, I do think
Chad Centerman.
Chad
will be
Centerman.
our impromptu metaphorical centrist candidate.
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
and I'm just thinking as well if like this is something that would resonate with the American public, as opposed because like I feel like whenever I hear it proposed, it's always by kind of like wonky people that are not very personally invested in it because they're all too old to have to care about this idea.
That's true. I mean, you'd have
it's
to
easy
do a
to
lot of
propose.
work.
It's easy to propose a policy that you will bear none of the brunt of, right?
Right, but you could also like it's just a messaging thing in terms of like could you not pitch it to a generation of like, hey, you're the first generation to spearhead this, brand new and fundamental new part of American society. You have an opportunity to shape it,
but it is also coerced,
like, you set the precedent.
Right?
Well, because it's like, but this sounds like a libertarian. Well, taxes are coerced. It's like,
no, but I mean, like, it's difficult to get like young people to like.
I agree.
Be excited about a forced.
I acknowledge
assignment.
The difficulty of the degree to which it should be implemented, but I believe with the proper gusto and ambition, and charisma, this could be implemented.
All right.
Those are my 4 policies, JJ.
Okay.
We have the rest of the hour to discuss whatever we want.
Yes.
I have a number of questions here.
Okay.
In this folder right here, I have information that will lead to the arrest of Hillary Clinton. Okay. Hillary Clinton is an interdimensional psychic vampire. No. But I would like to talk about something that an interdimensional psychic vampire would support. What are your thoughts, JJ, on MAiD, medical assistance in death?
Oh.
It is a controversial topic for people who do not know.
Yeah.
It's essentially euthanasia. Euthanasia is a common practice, usually for like very elderly people or terminally ill people who are going to die anyway. But my understanding is in Canada, they have expanded MAiD to the point where, like the example that was used was a physically healthy, I think he was like 18 or 19 years old, an 18 or 19-year-old man who I think had diabetes or something, not like a terminal illness, but an illness. I mean, he was having a lot of mental health complications as well.
Yeah.
He was eligible for MAiD. And if not for, at the last minute, I think his parents intervened. The government would have euthanized him under the guise of, under
it's not the government
mental health.
that's euthanizing people.
Well, but the government would allow that. I mean, isn't that Is that not a fair? I don't think that's legal in the United States.
Well, the thing that makes this a difficult issue, and I've written about this in the Canadian context in particular, which is, obviously the context that I know best. The thing that makes it difficult in the Canadian context is that the Supreme Court of Canada has basically ruled that this is a constitutional right, right? So like the Canadian Constitution says that you have, the right to life, as the American Constitution does. And the Supreme Court of Canada has ruled that in order for the right to life to be meaningful, you also have to be able to control the circumstances of your own death, like that is a sort of logical extension of that right.
Sure.
And I don't know what you think of that. Because, okay, first tell me just what you think of that.
Yeah, no, look, I mean, euthanasia in its proper context, assuming there is one, I think is like valid. If you're a terminally ill person and you want to choose the way that you go out, I think you should have that right.
Yes.
I do think it gets weird when you are eligible as like an 18-year-old with a non-terminal health problem, which I believe at a certain point, the MAiD guidelines or rules will be such that you don't even need to have a physical ailment. It could just be mental health.
Again,
that seems
but this also goes back to the idea of this being a constitutional right, because when the Supreme Court, I do not have all the dates memorized, but basically when the Supreme Court first ruled that, the federal government put in a lot of stipulations to sort of control this right. And then in subsequent sort of litigation, the other levels of the judiciary have said that you cannot impose that many restrictions on a constitutional right. It's kind of like abortion, right? Mm-hmm. Like in the sort of the pre-Roe v. Wade being overturned sort of universe, right? Abortion was a right, but various, sort of conservative governments tried to impose as many restrictions on the exercise of that right. And then it came to the courts to kind of adjudicate, well, when are the sort of policy burdens on the free exercise of that right so burdensome that they sort of are an infringement on the right? And that is kind of the debate that Canada's having now.
And this is the legal conversation, which is important. I guess I'm interested more broadly.
But I think it matters.
It's like a universal human issue. It shouldn't.
Well, but it matters, right? Because it's like if you accept that this, like presumably if you accept that this is a fundamental human right, and you believe that we have enlightened constitutions that protect fundamental human rights, then, you kind of have to have the legal argument, right? Because you're basically sort of saying, how much restriction can you place on this right before it becomes an infringement of the right? And I think that that's kind of the conversation that the Canadians are having. And it's a very difficult one. And I think the courts have been too permissive. Like, I think that because like part of the reason why they're allowing mental health to be sort of qualify as eligibility for MAiD is because the Trudeau administration does not think the courts would uphold a restriction on mental health, like a qualifier that says, mental health is exempt. Sure. They feel like that would probably be unconstitutional. It's not because, they want more people to be committing, committing
That's fair.
MAiD.
That's
right?
fair. It is a complicated topic. I'm interested in the underlying morality of it in terms of like, I watched a 40-minute documentary about it. And at one point, one of the women said, we are offering death as a form of healthcare.
Yeah.
And that struck me as something very interesting in a dark way, like philosophically, in terms of like, well, do you have the right to take your own life? It's kind of like, yeah, I can see that, but there's kind of a deeper spiritual argument that
part of it is just that, like, do we fundamentally trust people to make that decision?
Well, true. Yeah, that's
and it's because it's like, for example, like in Canada, there's been a lot of coverage of the degree to which sort of like homeless people or like really destitute people or really poor people are doing it. And, that I think leaves a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. But a lot of sort of the advocates for the, underclass type of people have said, like, who are you to be so condescending and to assume that just because somebody is poor that they cannot make a rational assessment of the circumstances of their life?
So this is something interesting because this is one of the newer, let's say, dialectics that I've discovered in terms of this underlies virtually a lot of the major disagreements I see, not least of which is Russia versus the West, which is idea of positive freedom versus negative freedom.
Yeah.
I Are you familiar with that distinction?
Of course.
Okay. Well, of course you are.
No,
you
I mean, this is one of the sort of like the freedom from versus freedom to.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
And I was not aware of this, or I'd heard of it, negative freedom versus positive freedom, where essentially the classic, I think, liberal notion, the Western notion, is we have what's called negative freedom, which is not, to say it's bad, but it's the idea that it's freedom from.
Yeah.
So freedom from coercion. You have the right to live your life in the way you see fit,
Yes.
and institutions should minimally
Yes.
infringe on that right, except for
Yes.
the protection of others, right? And then there's the other side of that, which is positive freedom. And
Yes.
positive freedom is the idea that, when we talk about freedom, we don't mean freedom from like legal interference or infringement. We mean freedom to live a meaningful life, or like freedom to pursue some higher spiritual end.
Or
like an example that was just
Yeah.
that was very helpful for me was a drug addict.
yeah.
Right? Is someone who is addicted to heroin on the streets of let's say Philadelphia,
Yes.
Kensington, Philadelphia is particularly bad, or LA or wherever. Is that person who is mentally ill and addicted to heroin, is that person truly free? And is, forcibly getting them off the street and getting them help, is that an infringement on their freedom? It's like, my gut says no. Obviously, there's, you can take it too far, but that's an interesting, I'd say dialectic or tension that I am continuing to explore moving forward.
I mean,
in the interest of furthering enlightened centrism.
I think that, in a lot of other countries, their constitutions are more explicit in sort of stating what every citizen has a right to. In America and Canada, we kind of have this right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And in Canada, there's like, a few other qualifications, like, you have a right to English or French as your sort of your language of day-to-day conduct with the state and this kind of thing, right? But like in a lot of other countries, they have affirmative rights where it's like you have a right to healthcare, you have a right to a good paying job, and like these kind of like aspirational rights,
which would be positive freedom.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. They are positive freedoms,
Yeah.
right? Because they're like the government has an obligation to provide its citizens with a certain standard of living. And I feel, and we're using standard of living in a broad sense, not just a material kind of like how big is your paycheck kind of sense, right? Like you have a right to certain, like if we identified like what is a good life sort of made up, what are the component parts of that good life, and that there's a health part, there's a financial part, there's a safety part, and there is a liberty part, there might even be a sort of linguistic or cultural part, right? And
Amen.
I feel like
Si, senor.
I feel like the American system and, the Canadian system as well, like, and, like the British system, like that we inherit this from, I feel has just been much more hostile to that idea. Like the idea that government has an obligation to provide you with things. And I certainly think on the kind of the right-wing side of things, there's incredible hostility to that. Like you have right-wing people that even believe that there is no sort of like affirmative right to vote, for instance, right? Like they sort of view that any time that you're asking for something, that is kind of like unconstitutional and bad and suspect.
Yeah.
Your only right is a kind of like right of sort of being unmolested by the state.
Yeah, I think, was it Matt Walsh who recently said something about, maybe it was Ben Shapiro as well, who said you shouldn't automatically register voters or something like that?
Yeah, like this is a sort of...
I understand the argument that, like I think Australia has mandatory voting.
Yeah.
I could see how that could go wrong in that.
But that's not what they're talking about.
Don't you want only the people who are informed to go and vote? Because otherwise,
yeah,
I would think people like
Yeah.
Trump, who are very bombastic and
Yeah.
don't talk at all about policy,
Yeah.
are more likely to win in that regard.
I mean, they're not talking about that specifically. They're talking about this in the context of like, some states have automatic voter registration, right?
Right.
So like there's basically, in their mind, they would sort of say, well, there's like no burden to voting at all. Like you just sort of show up at the voting place and then like they already have your name on the list and it's all sort of done for you. And
Which I
sort of-
like. I don't see why I should need to register.
Yeah,
it seems
I
like
don't.
additional steps.
I agree. And I feel like the only sort of argument in favor of making voting harder is for groups that have like political parties or whatever that have an interest in sort of suppressing voter turnout because they know that the more people that will vote, the harder it's going to be for them to get elected, right?
Yeah.
But
I don't
anyway,
wanna
the
dig
point
too
is
deep on-
no, but the point is
suppressing is a strong word.
well, you know what I mean, right?
yeah, I do
the
know
point,
what you mean, which is you're a left-wing shill. Just kidding.
The point though is that this is what I'm sort of saying, like in the American political conversation, I think there's a lot of people that are really dug into a kind of fundamentally small government conception of what rights are.
Yeah.
And the idea of affirmative rights is, I think, very foreign to a certain faction of the American political conversation, to the point where some people's instinctive reaction is to just demagogue very hard against it and say, like, when people are saying you don't even have a right to vote, I think it is very difficult to say that you have sort of an affirmative right to health care or a certain level of safety or things like that.
Definitely. Which I still need to iron out my opinions in terms of like universal health care. I know the United States healthcare system is broken in a lot of ways.
Yeah. But it's like even
whether universal
independent
healthcare is the right answer, whether it's Medicare for all.
regardless, it's
but
like
I am definitely sympathetic to the idea that my fellow citizens should not be in a situation where if they're walking down the street and a car tire, flies off a car and hits them in the back, and they have to have $10,000, $20,000, $50,000 surgery. Like, I'm happy to be part of a risk to buy into a common insurance to prevent that risk. It's like, because anything can happen. The other side of that is, well, if you eat 5 cheeseburgers a day and need 4 triple bypasses, like, to what degree is it society's responsibility to pay for it?
And this is, but that's a good example, right? It's a good example because what you're describing it. If there was, say, an American right to health in the Constitution, like if it's like, every American has a right to health, then the courts could presumably adjudicate these kind of edge cases and sort of sort that out, right?
Sure.
So
fair. Shifting gears.
Okay.
What do you think about the Ontario?
Excuse me.
We'll restart. What do you think about the Ontario College of Psychologists requiring Jordan Peterson to undergo social media retraining?
Yeah. I mean, this has been obviously a topic of great interest on the right wing in both Canada and America recently. I'm not super plugged into it because I'm not terribly invested in Jordan Peterson the way that you are. But, I mean, it's not like big government forcing Jordan Peterson to undergo like re-education the way that I think some on the right wing have tried to present it. It's just, I mean, the way that I could sort of interpret it in the most sort of neutral way possible is like, what rights does a professional organization have over its membership? To what and like this has been a subject of considerable adjudication in both Canada and America, right? It's like for any sort of professional structured organization, career-based, it's a club, a social club, even a church. There was some litigation in Canada recently about, do the Jehovah's Witnesses have to meet some sort of constitutional bar when they disfellowship somebody, when they kick somebody out of the church? Like, can they sort of have arbitrary rules? There's been Christian churches in both Canada and America, or not Christian churches. There's been Christian schools in both Canada and America that have tried to, kick out students because they don't conform with, say, very hardline sort of social policies against sex or homosexuality or things like that. So, the question of which, like, when does any sort of professional organization go too far in imposing membership criteria? And I don't know. I don't know if this case necessarily rises to the level where the membership criteria is so unforgiving that Jordan Peterson can really use the language of rights in pleading his case.
Well, my perspective is the role of the Ontario, College of Psychologists?
Yes, which is not a government organization. This is a professional organization.
Is it not a quasi-government? Aren't they the ones that issue, like, can you not practice in Ontario without their approval? They have government-backed authority, don't they? From a licensing perspective?
Yeah, like the government, but I mean, the government could withdraw that and give it to some other professional
but for now, they have government.
But it's like the government,
authority.
But the government doesn't like appoint their members or anything like that. The government doesn't dictate their criteria.
Right, so they're an unaccountable government.
I suppose you could make
bureaucracy.
That case.
Well, okay, but this is the argument against, or the argument that it's going too far. It's an act of political speech suppression. Is the Ontario College of Psychologists, I believe from their website, says something to the effect of the purpose of the college is to regulate the quality of the services delivered by our members, which is meaning psychological services.
Yes.
So, in my opinion, it's sort of like the FDA telling a restaurant, like, hey, the FDA's job as it relates to restaurants.
But it's not analogous to the FDA. This is more like.
Hold on, let me finish the analogy.
Yeah. Okay.
The FDA's job is to regulate the quality of the food to make sure it's not, filled with disease and filled with rat feces and all that, right? It's not the FDA's job to say, okay, well, mom and pop shop or whatever, whoever, you can't say these things. They have a specific role to regulate to ensure that the food delivered is not unhealthy or tainted or whatever. Okay. It seems like obviously it's different. One's food and one's therapy. I need both, but the analogy applies where it's the role of the Ontario College of Psychologists is to ensure the quality of the services delivered.
Yes.
Meaning anytime Jordan Peterson enters a clinical relationship with a client, that's their jurisdiction.
Yes.
Not what he says on Twitter. And I would say if there was, let's just make up an American equivalent, if there was something equivalent or an American one.
I'm sure there is an American one. I'm sure there's like
okay.
a Texas board
so
of
if there was this, if there were psychologists or many psychologists who tweeted out, I think Donald Trump acts like a narcissist. I think Donald Trump is an asshole. I think Donald Trump is mentally ill.
Yeah.
I think it would be wrong for some agency or some licensing agency to say to that psychologist, ooh, this doesn't reflect well on us, so you're not allowed to criticize Trump. It's like, no. That's free speech. Yeah. So long as there is no reason to believe that the quality of the services you are delivering are being impaired, I think it's perfectly reasonable to allow that to stay the same.
But who decides that? Who decides that?
Well, I mean, I guess the courts, but what do you mean who decides it?
Well, I mean, like if this is an independent organization that is not bound directly by the Constitution in that sort of way, I mean, it might be bound.
I mean, ultimately it comes to the judgment of individuals. I mean, that's just...
No,
like
but
a food inspector, who decides whether a restaurant meets its criteria? It's the guy inspecting the restaurant.
Yeah, but in that case, you're having a sort of agents of the state who have sort of like a mandate from the people, like they're congressionally authorized to do this and that and that. When you have sort of like a professional organization that has its own sort of standards, however idiosyncratic those standards might be, the question then becomes like, well, at what point does government know better? Like, you know, if you and I make our centrist club and we come up with criteria of who can be a member of the centrist club in good standing, you know, at what point does government kind of come in and say, well, actually, we know more about what makes for a good centrist than you two clowns, so we'll tell you.
I'm not saying that the government should do this or that. I'm arguing about the morality of the situation, just broadly. Just if you to render a judgment on the situation as is, it's like it seems like that's an overreach. Like in my opinion, if a left-wing psychologist, which I'm sure is the case, publicly criticizes Donald Trump in a way that's like semi-unprofessional, calling him a narcissist or something, which I bet you there are plenty of people who are licensed psychologists or social workers or something like that who say things like that. And I believe I think it's a rule, not like a law, but like you're not supposed to ever diagnose if you're a you're not supposed to diagnose.
I think they call it the Goldwater rule.
Yeah, something like that. Right, which is like, okay, probably not good practice, but again, it is not that agency's job to regulate that person's speech. Their job is to regulate the services.
Yeah, but again,
that's my opinion.
Yeah, but I'm just sort of saying,
can you
like,
at least see where I'm coming from?
No, I can see where you're coming from. Absolutely, but
that's all I ever ask. Okay.
What I'm just sort of saying is that, like, I know that you like to sort of philosophize about these kinds of things and make them broader and more abstract. So I'm just saying that if we make this broader and more abstract, it's kind of hard
more deeper and down to earth, not broader and more abstract, deeper and down to earth.
But I'm saying that, like,
is it too far? Don't get all in the legal mumbo jumbo.
No, I'm not getting into legal mumbo jumbo, but I'm saying, like, even as a matter of sort of general abstract principle, I think it's very difficult to sort of say that government has a better judgment of an independent group's membership criteria than that group itself, right? Like,
sure. Yes. I agree with that. That makes sense.
So it's like, you know, I'm inclined to err on the side of letting groups determine their own membership. And if it sucks, you know, you can always make your own group and maybe lobby the government to recognize you.
Fair enough. I think given that they are a licensing body and have legal authority, I believe that's what a license is commercial legal authority.
Yeah.
It makes it more complicated. But let's move on.
All right.
Okay. This is something we need to discuss.
All right.
I'm going to do an I statement. I feel that you are incorrect when you call me right-wing.
Okay.
Okay? Compared to you on some issues, that's fair.
Yeah.
I don't view right-wing as inherently bad. I don't view left-wing as inherently bad. I will call you left-wing a left-wing shill. I'll call you whoever a right-wing fundamentalist, something like that. But why do you insist that I am right wing?
Just because I think,
because you know it bugs me because it's not true.
Yeah, but I think that it is true.
Compared to you, I agree with that. But I don't know. Like, hold on. Certainly, I get. It's funny because when I talk to right wingers, the Crucible is a channel that I have done debates on and stuff. They're very right wing. Yeah. I'm the liberal, libcuck, libtard, all that shit.
I don't know. You seem pretty chummy with him when you were talking with him.
Okay. People would say the same thing. I was chummy with Vosh. It's like, I'm chummy with whoever because, listen, I'm just a nice guy.
No.
All right? Okay? I get along with everyone. But for real, like, yes, compared to you, that's fine. And, but like earlier, you started off the podcast by saying, well, how are we going to get transphobic or something like that? It's like, I do resent that to some degree.
Yeah.
Because for example, on that issue of whatever trans issues, gender ideology stuff, is like, I do believe the biggest barrier to acceptance on the part of transgender adults is the fact that people associate supporting the rights of adults to get medical treatment or whatever. They associate that with, but I don't believe that a 14-year-old should be getting a double mastectomy or something like that. Yeah. Right? And the fact that the ACLU and all kinds of organizations will say, trans healthcare is healthcare for children too, or whatever. It's like, it is a very complicated issue. I believe it's very wrong. You tweeted out earlier the
story in the National Post.
Right, about how many hundreds of children in Canada under the age of 18, as young as 14, getting their breasts surgically removed. Okay, I regard that as a serious problem. And not just because it's wrong in and of itself, but also because that's the kind of shit that feeds the right-wing propaganda machine, which I absolutely agree does exist, to say, this is why we should just shut it all down. No transgender surgery or anything for anyone, adults or children. Right? And while we're at it, ban gay marriage and stuff like that. I'm firmly opposed to that. And I call you a, Donald Rumsfeld shill, so obviously I can expect some, bullshit back. But the reason I like to, call myself enlightened centrist or whatever, again, still working on the marketing. I think I'll go with politically non-binary. We'll see how it goes.
Oh boy!
But because no matter what label, if I say I'm right-wing, it's like if Andrew Wilson was in that chair, this would be the exact opposite conversation in terms of I'm a liberal progressive in sheep's clothing because I believe there's value to religion or whatever. Right? You understand my perspective?
Well,
I said, I'm only ever interested and getting people to understand where I'm coming from. You don't have to agree with me.
I don't know. I guess like as I get older, I just kind of like realize that most people are sortable and most people do in fact fit pretty comfortably in one camp or the other, as much as a lot of people like to protest sort of the political binary. I feel...
You think J-Reg can fit into one camp or the other?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Well, I mean, I shouldn't say that.
Yeah, that's right. This is confidential information. We won't do that. Okay, all right, fair enough, but continue.
No, I think that like you just kind of look at people's background, you look at their basic sort of disposition, you look what they like to talk about more than other issues, you look at where their passions lie, you look at where what issues do they prioritize and what issues do they spend a great deal of time talking and arguing and fighting for versus what issues are they kind of like abstractly in favor of in a kind of passive way, but doesn't seem to kind of like animate and energize them.
How does this then justify?
Well, it's like, when it comes to sort of like clearly trans stuff is something that you care a great deal about. Like you talk about it a lot.
Do you not believe what I just told you about why I care about it?
I mean, I cannot read your soul, obviously.
Okay, that's fair. Listen, I respect the honesty 100%. Yeah. I mean,
I do get the impression that
I think it is ridiculous and disgusting and pathetic and cringy and creepy for someone like Matt Walsh to say, you know what? An adult has no right to make a decision what to do with their body regarding if they want to pursue certain medical procedures. I would fight that tooth and nail. That's fucking bullshit.
Yeah.
Okay? But when it comes to kids, it's a fundamentally and categorically different issue.
Yeah.
Like, and if you say, well, that's just... I'm really on Matt Walsh's side and all this. Like, trust me, I'm not.
No, I know. And you made your major video. I guess it wasn't Matt Walsh.
I think he's probably the person I've gone after, a single individual most.
Yeah. And you did the other video, but it was Michael Knowles, right? Who said, let's exterminate the trans...
It said, talk about eradicating transgenderism.
Yeah.
Which is, and people say, oh, like, there's no trans genocide and this is all extreme term. And it's like, yes, obviously not right now. But that is the language of genocide and disgust. And it's like, that concerns me, and I don't know, which is fair enough. You don't know, you can't.
No. But what I'm saying is that I'm
telling you what I believe.
I'm saying that when social change comes to town, there is a certain person.
Social change is always in town.
Whose disposition is to be wary and skeptical and critical of those making the proposals.
Right, and that's not me at all. I'm advocating for mandatory civil service.
Well, I mean, I think that sort of some of the most challenging forms of social change comes from, historically marginalized groups that are sort of demanding rights that become intrusive to the culture and rhythm of life that the majority has become accustomed to, right? And I feel like, the trans issue is the most recent manifestation of a story we've seen play out many times in the past, where sort of like a previously marginalized group begins to sort of assert itself in the culture. And a lot of people react with disgust and revulsion at this upsetting of the quote unquote way things are supposed to be in the natural order of the universe.
Okay.
Right. And I feel like, I can totally concede that you have some nuanced opinions on this, but I definitely feel like the incentive structure that you inhabit as a commentator is probably pushing you in the kind of more demagogic anti-trans direction.
I'll just ask you this straight up. Do you think it is wrong to surgically remove the breasts of a 13-year-old girl for the purposes of gender or sex reassignment surgery?
I don't know. I honestly do not know. I think that this is an issue that involves a very small number of families.
True.
I think it involves questions of identity that are hard for outsiders to adjudicate.
True.
And
certainly identity is a very complicated issue nowadays.
And it's like, part of it is informed by my experience as a gay man as well. And, the experience that I had coming out of the closet and being open, and the degree to which sort of, I faced people, I was born in the 1980s. So like I grew up in a time that was relatively homophobic, and a time when it was not uncommon to hear people say that gay people are faking it, or they just want attention, or it's a phase and they're going to I had even some of this kind of stuff with my own family, the sort of the lack of understanding of who I was as a person and being my true self, and getting people to take seriously the expression of your true self. So there's a part of me that is a little sort of perhaps personally allergic to those who come around and tell individuals or families that they know what's best for them, and that the decisions that they make as a family are somehow wrong, right? Especially when we're already having like just such a robust conversation in general in the culture, whether it involves, vaccines or anything else, abortion,
What you just said is more than reasonable. The reasons that you just gave for why you are sympathetic, or why you're not quick to hop on I say that double mastectomies for teenage girls, I say that's degenerate and disgusting. And I believe it's important to do that, because it's true.
Yeah.
Right? In my opinion, I guess, to the degree that these things are just opinions.
Yeah.
But if sane people in the center do not call it out for what it is, then it's the Matt Walshes and the Michael Knowles who say, let's eradicate transgenderism. They're the ones who everyone goes, you know what? These are the people who are the loudest advocates against this crazy shit going on with kids, which, fair enough.
Yeah.
There's there's a deeper discussion about the medical literature surrounding it. I've looked into it. I've done videos on the studies.
I mean,
they're utter bullshit.
It's such a new phenomenon, though.
Among other issues that are there. But there's almost a separate issue of it's not even about the medical data. It's because I don't want to go down this.
But it's like what I would say though is that I feel like our personal revulsion for something is not necessarily the strongest argument against it, and that we should be wary.
Yeah, but sometimes it is.
Sometimes it is.
Yeah, there's a. Yes, I mean, there's a reason we regard. We're going to have to use YouTube-friendly terminology here. Yeah. But there's a reason why child involvement, involvement between adults and children.
Yes.
We shouldn't have to rationalize. Well, can you cite a study that suggests that this is a no, that's just bad.
Yes, I agree.
Is.
But at the same time, for example...
hold on.
Yes.
To my point about sane people in the center, you'll notice it's the far-right people who say, to be transgender, to be gay is to be that. Yes. And it's no, you fucking moron. That's bullshit. But if they're the only ones who are calling out the actual nonsense relating to children undergoing irreversible surgery, then that gives them credit that they shouldn't have. That's my point.
Yeah, I mean, right? It's definitely, but it is fundamentally pardon me?
It is complicated.
Well, and but again, Philosophy Tube, the YouTuber, did a video on this once, and they made a comment that I thought was pretty persuasive, where she sort of said that I think she was like in medical school or something. And, she once watched a surgery like where they opened up some guy's ribs with the rib spreaders and like how gory and horrific it was. And it's like, that's grotesque and monstrous. But at the same time, like we can recognize that it served a useful function.
Yes, I agree. Just because you find something disgusting is not.
And I just feel like a lot of this, of this kind of stuff is just the argument is fundamentally, this is gross and weird and not normal, and therefore government should put a stop to it. And I don't know. It's just like, it would be interesting to talk to some of these families and hear their story and hear these voices, right? And not just like the most unattractive, unsympathetic case studies that we can possibly find, which gets so amplified in the right-wing media, people that have transitioned and regret it, these kinds of things, right? Like if you listen to, because that's what I think a lot about. It's like, I was thinking about this the other day. It's like to put yourself in somebody else's shoes is really a very important aspect of trying to have any sort of reasonable political conversation.
Right, which is why even though I regard this as an obvious, it's pretty clear, it's a pretty easy softball. Hey, it's wrong to cut off the breast of 13-year-olds. The reasons that you just gave, I'm like, okay, that's fair. That makes sense. So I agree with you.
Yeah.
Not in the...
No, but it's like, I don't know, but it's like, but I say, it would be interesting to just hear some of these families tell their story. There's not many of them. That's also worth noting. Somebody pointed out the other day that more underage girls get boob jobs than boob removals. So like, that's sort of something that's worth keeping in mind as well. Like this is ultimately a very small subset of the population. And then we have to have some degree of faith that like, or at least err on the side of assuming that if a family is going to do something this dramatic, well, maybe they have, their own reasons for doing it that aren't necessarily assisted by strangers intruding.
Perhaps. The argument about autonomy of family decisions could be made for gay conversion therapy. Should a family have a right to make that decision with their doctor? We say no, because gay conversion therapy is clearly
quack science,
right? And and I bet my life and everything I don't have a reputation, but I bet everything I have socially on the fact that it is pseudoscience bullshit that is being pushed, or all the studies that claim that children do not experience regret. Adults, the science is much clearer, I believe. To the degree that I've looked into it for adults. I actually take a lot of it for granted that it works for adults.
Yes.
It's the studies with children that I've actually looked at or whatnot.
I mean,
and again, it's not conflating the rights of adults. And there are even cases where I think puberty blockers could be administered to children.
Yes.
Ken Zucker, who, notorious transphobe Jordan Peterson, Peterson said he likes Zucker's method of how he handled it with children, where it was a wait-and-see approach. There are some kids who, from like 3 years old, experience gender dysphoria their whole life. There may be cases where, puberty blockers, they have been administered.
Yes.
And it was only recently brought to the right wing's perspective because of all the other crazy shit.
Yeah.
But like, if we can't draw a clear moral line on a 13-year-old with no prior history of gender dysphoria, like until they were 11 or 12 or something like that.
Okay, let me
clearly
tell you.
There's an effect of social media.
Yeah.
And social contagion is the technical term.
Yeah. Let me tell you the true centrist position on all of this, right? And I do sort of think
this is the dark centrist position. The enlightened centrist with this background is here. The dark centrist.
So the dark centrist position on this would be that like one kind of compromise solution that is very rarely discussed, and I think for reasons that will become clear, is that if we just had a society that was a little bit more comfortable with gender fluidity, right?
Totally. Agreed.
Like if we had
just because you play with toys or play with Barbies when you're a 5-year-old boy or whatever doesn't mean you're literally a female. You don't need to have your sex changed.
Yes.
We could just accept that everyone is non-binary. Everyone, and I mean that, everyone has masculine and feminine aspects. There are feminine men, there are masculine women, and there's a spectrum.
Yes.
All of this medical intervention underneath it doesn't make any sense. That's my point.
Yeah, and I think that the problem then is that the right wing does not want to concede that point, right? Like the right wing simultaneously does not want people to get gender reassignment surgery at any point in time. And the right wing also does not want to see boys wearing dresses. They don't want to see they, them pronouns.
Wrong. Hold on.
Yeah.
Partly wrong. Depends on what you mean by right wing. Matt Walsh, absolutely. That is why Matt Walsh is the right wing dweeb. When I think of left wing dweebs and right wing dweebs, left wing dweebs are Antifa goofballs and all these like crazy particular gender ideologue activists and all that. Matt Walsh is on the other side.
Yeah.
Jordan Peterson very clearly articulates the case for how androgyny or men, having like feminine clothing and all that stuff can actually be a very sophisticated personality type. All of the Mick Jagger and David Bowie and all these people, all these rock stars that I think classically masculine men they dressed up in feminine clothing. That didn't mean they were literally female. That's the point.
But the thing is that when you look at sort of the right-wing commentary class these days.
The far right.
No, not even the far right. Like you look at sort of mainstream conservative people like Ben Shapiro, Candace Owens. Like they spend a lot of time.
I would put Candace Owens pretty close to she's middle far right.
Okay, but anyway, the point is like
depends on how we use these terms.
The Daily Wire
far right means
well, even
Nazi.
like the Fox News crew, for instance. Let's sort of take them for an example, right? Like there's a huge obsession with this idea that like men aren't masculine enough these days, women aren't feminine enough these days, and we're going to like really sort of gender police all sorts of gender expressions. You know, Harry Styles wears a dress on the cover of Vogue, and this is sort of seen as the downfall of Western civilization. Like there's a lot of this kind of like bullying people into gender conformity, and that's bad because then if you want to have an alternative path to gender expression that doesn't involve medicalizing it, that doesn't involve surgery, you have to be able to create spaces where people can play with gender and be free, particularly when they're young.
That's what I believe.
No, that's good.
That's my point. Right. And that's why I'm against the medical aspect of it for children.
Yeah.
Because they should be free to do whatever their internal self identity and exploration wants to do. That's healthy for development.
Have you seen this? This kind of like meme on Twitter where it's like the fellas, is it gay too?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. There's all kinds of.
But again, it's like
cultural meme stuff.
Bringing it back to you specifically, though, it's just like to what degree do you spend time talking about? We need to have a society that's more comfortable with gender fluidity versus how much time do you spend bemoaning the fact that people are getting...
I will make you a bet for $100 Canadian dollars.
Okay.
I believe in 80 to 90% of every video that I have made related to this topic.
Yes.
I specifically say something to the effect of gender is a social construct, masculine and feminine, that has to do with behavior. And sex is the underlying binary reality.
Yes.
We should be free to move around on the social aspect, masculine and feminine, but male and female, if we're going to do drastic, irreversible medical intervention there, that should be reserved for adults who are giving informed consent. I talked to a transsexual clinical social worker, the National Social Worker of the Year, I think in 2018, 2019, 2020, somewhere around there, Xander Keeg, who... born a female, now has a very thick beard. You wouldn't be able to tell that he was born a female. I have no problem referring to people by the pronouns that make sense in terms of appearance.
Yes.
And for people who say, you shouldn't call Blair White a she because you're lying. It's like, well, she looks like a fucking woman, so I'm going to call her that. And Dylan Mulvaney looks like a man, so I'm calling him a man. So either side who wants to impose on my language can go fuck off. That's my opinion.
Dylan Mulvaney is a woman.
What was I just ranting about that was leading up to that?
You were talking about gender expression and the degree that you talk or don't talk about this.
Yes. Yes. So, Xander Keeg, who I refer to as he.
Yeah.
He is a social worker who had to give informed consent letters.
Yes.
He specifically stated they're very complicated, and it's to suggest that a child, their parents shouldn't be making those irreversible decisions for their child. The child should have to understand it. And I don't believe a 13-year-old has the capacity to read an informed consent letter.
Okay. So
having to do with
the amount of time that we have spent talking about this relative to the amount of time we've spent talking
I don't
about
like
other
the fact
things.
that you said I was transphobic. I generally I don't give a shit about those type of terms, but coming from you, who, at least is willing to come here and have this conversation.
Yes.
It is the lesson that I have learned is that I clearly need to do a better job of speaking to valid points you just made. Although, again, go back to our bet. I believe in virtually all my videos. I make that very clear.
Yeah. But again, what I would just sort of say is that if you feel equally passionate about both sort of dimensions of your position on this, then I feel like when we look at your output, we should see you spending equal amounts of time talking about those specific parts of the argument. Like equal amounts of time denouncing underage gender reassignment surgery as you spend equal amounts of time talking about why we need a more gender fluid
Going
society.
after Matt Walsh?
Yeah.
That's what... All right. All right. I will take this information into account. What you need to do is you need to go back and watch those videos related to that, because I'm doing exactly what you're saying, which is
I remember the Michael
It gives me
Knowles
confidence
video.
that we are aligned on this more so than it might appear.
Yeah.
What do you want to talk about?
What
now?
else? What else do you have
listen,
in your
there's I feel like globalism versus nationalism is a whole separate thing. We've got 20 minutes, right, Spider? Do you want to talk about anything? I mean, I've got some stuff, but
I want to hear your stuff. You're the MC.
All right. I've already said this, but in this folder, I have information that will lead to the arrest of Hillary Clinton.
Need a second joke, Paul.
It's true.
Have you ever heard this line about like?
Do you think I? We were talking about this earlier about the issue of I joke too much.
Yeah.
Do you think I joke too much?
No, it's fine. You're young, Paul. You're still learning.
Right. That's the thing. Okay. This is my.
Yeah.
I said this to you earlier.
Yeah.
Okay. I know that I know very little.
Yeah.
So for me to view myself as I'm a political commentator.
Yes.
In a suit, talking to a very well-known Canadian political commentator. Here I am. I should conduct myself with the appropriate, and I'm intellectual. And all this. Well, let's not get emotional. It's like, I know I'm not that.
Yes.
So the reason you can call it resort to jokes or whatnot, is because I am an idiot. I know I'm an idiot. I believe any truly intelligent person recognizes that they know very little.
Yes. And
I don't want to give the impression that I know more than I do. Like I'm like on the, not to bring this up, but like the reason I get very passionate about it is because of all the things that I'm most certain in.
Yes.
It is that the gender stuff with children, the medical interventions on children will absolutely, I am on the right side of history. That's what I believe that 100%. You know how people on like Black Lives Matter were like, we're on the right side of history fighting against white supremacy? I believe I'm on the right side of history for this. That's what I believe, based on my assessment of how things are moving with detransitioners and how the European countries are going back on a lot of this stuff. So that I'm willing to get passionate about or whatnot. But like when we talk about Ukraine or something like that, it's like, look, I know very little. I have my opinions. I'm willing to share them.
Yes.
That's the reality that we live in. I hope that the only thing that I'm trying to be is authentic. Meaning I'm trying to tell you what I honestly believe. And I am a class clown, fucking humor as a defense mechanism.
Yes.
So I likely lean on that a bit too much.
I think that, but this kind of goes back to sort of something that I was saying earlier, is that I do think that when we think about how people get sorted into the right-wing camp or the left-wing camp, it is generally determined by which issues within those two coalitions interest them the most, which ones do they like talking about the most, which ones are they most well-informed on, which ones are they most passionate about, right? It's a reason why, like, for example, a lot of businessmen tend to be politically conservative, why they tend to lean Republican. It's because, independent of what they might think about abortion or immigration or, the healthcare system or whatever, fundamentally what they care about is business and business regulation, and that's what they know best, and so that's why they lean towards the party that has a sort of more pro-business agenda.
Okay, that's a perfect example of, I think, that being too one-dimensional, because within the category of businessmen are managers and entrepreneurs.
Yes.
Entrepreneurs are very left-wing. Most of Silicon Valley is left-wing. Most people who start companies
I don't think so. I mean, I think Silicon Valley is sort of infamous now for getting much more right-wing, much more sort of libertarian.
Really?
Yeah. You look at somebody like Elon, right? Like,
okay, Elon Musk, the one guy, which is why he is
Peter
as popular as he
Thiel
is.
and like all of like Peter Thiel's like freakazoids that he's sort of chummy with in Silicon Valley. Like, no, it's like the
if you look at the graph of donations to political parties by company, it's like 99 or 97% blue for like all of the top 100 tech companies.
Yeah. I mean,
so you can point out some individual exceptions. And again, Peter Thiel's this is the problem with the language. It's like Peter
Yeah.
Thiel's gay, right?
Yeah.
I believe Peter Thiel supports gay marriage. I could
Yeah,
be
well,
wrong.
but Peter Thiel
the
does
fact
not.
that you refer to him as a right-wing freak,
But
it's like
see,
you're using
again,
you are obscuring the important distinction between someone like Peter Thiel and someone like Matt Walsh.
But Peter Thiel does not, like, his political movement is not based around fighting for gay rights. In fact, that issue seems to interest him very little. His political movement is about, fighting for, less immigration and kind of more sort of like white nationalist kind of ethnopolitics. And
do you believe that do you believe that wanting a strong border makes you a right-winger?
I think it's coded as a right-wing issue, right?
Coded as a right-wing issue.
Well, I mean, in the sense that, like
if I said,
instead of saying coded,
illegal,
I should say
I think illegal immigration is a major problem.
Yeah,
in the
I think
United
everybody
States, and
agrees
we need
with
to address that. No, I don't think everyone agrees with that. I think there's a lot of people who believe no human is illegal.
I think
that's a vastly larger sentiment than people realize. I think it's actually very dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that I think that like the real sort of hardcore, no one is illegal kind of sort of left-wing political activists, I feel like that they have a lot of oxygen in the American political discourse that is disproportionate to how many Americans actually share that opinion. But at the same time,
true.
Like, I think that
another reason social media is a problem, and we should show me the algorithms or show us the algorithms.
The sort of Trumpified Republican position that immigration in general is bad is also a position that is not shared by most Americans. Most Americans actually have a centrist position.
What is Trump?
So hold on. So most Americans, if we're talking about like sort of true centrist policy, most Americans favor a kind of position that's not championed by either party, which is that they want legal immigration to be easier and possibly even increased, but they want illegal immigration to be really cracked down on and dramatically decreased. Right?
I suspect there are a lot of politicians on both parties who actually say
if that was the case, then we'd get, bipartisan
Donald Trump,
legislation
there's a clip
passed.
of Donald Trump that I cite regularly in my videos where he says, we're going to build a wall, but in the wall, we're going to have a big, beautiful gate.
Yeah.
We're going to have a big, beautiful gate. And they can come. I want people to come in. But
again,
they have to do it legally. And it's like.
But again, he didn't champion any policies in that direction when he was in office. In fact, he had people like Stephen Miller.
Okay, I would have to look into that. That's
Stephen
fair.
Miller, was his like chief immigration advisor, and Stephen Miller was just like anti-immigration across the board, often in like very explicit language. That, almost like sort of the kind of the Tucker Carlson kind of great replacement sort of theory, like the idea that like immigration is fundamentally damaging to American culture and American identity and sort of the integrity of the American system.
I think illegal immigration is.
I think a lot of people think illegal.
Unchecked immigration is. Didn't you just agree that that is what most people believe, that unchecked illegal immigration is damaging to the culture?
No, because I don't think most people see it as a cultural issue. I think when most people think of illegal immigration, they think this is a law issue. These are people that are breaking the law.
Or an economic issue.
Yeah, or an economic issue, right? But I think primarily, like, Americans, by and large, very law and order people, just as Canadians are, right? Most middle-class people on this continent care about law and order. Most people favor things like the death penalty, very strong sentences.
Hold on, right there, law and order.
Law.
Law and order, people would say, is a right-wing code word. Like when Donald Trump called for law and order. That's right-wing coded.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that as a result, people that care...
But then you just used it.
Paul, let me finish my thought here. People who care primarily about law and order issues tend to vote Republican.
True.
Because Republicans care more about that issue and talk about it a lot more, right? Democrats don't care about that issue as much. I mean, I'm sure that individual Democrats...
but they still care about it.
Well, I mean, but this is exactly what I'm saying, right? In the same way that Peter Thiel cares about gay marriage, he doesn't spend a lot of time talking about it. Lots of Democrats care about illegal immigration as a bad thing and want to see it declined, but they don't make it the centerpiece of what they run on, or, when they're in the White House or whatever, they don't say, this is what I'm going to muster, the forces of the government to deal with as priority number one, the way that Trump tried to shut down all Middle Eastern immigration on the first day he was in office.
Yeah, that was goofy. That was dumb.
That shows
dumb.
But that shows
among many things that Trump has done and said that are dumb as hell.
But my point is not if it's dumb or good or whatever. My point is that it's a reflection of relative political priorities. One party, when they get into office, they do something on day one, versus a different party, when it gets into office, does something else on day one. And I think that you judge where people fall on the political spectrum by how they order their priorities, not just merely what they claim to care
and that
about.
is why, again, between you and I have no problem acknowledging that I am more right-wing than you are.
Yes.
Compared to you.
Yes. But and also compared to your positions and your priorities in the relevant political climate that we happen to inhabit in the year 2023.
No.
Yes.
No, I don't think so.
No, because I'm sort of saying, like, if you and I
think I am pretty smack dab in the center.
If it was the Paul administration versus the JJ administration, I think that the priorities of the Paul administration
I would arrest you and have you deported back
Yes.
to your
back to my godforsaken
your Soviet republic before I allow you to have office here in this glorious country.
Yeah, my sort of snowy wasteland.
Yeah, frozen wasteland.
Back to your igloo, JJ.
Yeah.
Yes, but but no, it's like, I think that if you were in the Oval Office and you sort of had to have your first 100 days, I think that probably on par, Republicans would be more happy with that first 100 days than Democrats would be. And I think Republican politicians, Republican voters.
You know what? Even if that was true, what is that evidence of?
Well, it's evidence
that those are bad?
No, it's not. It's absolutely
unless you're sneaking in the premise that Republicans by definition are bad.
No, I'm not
Democrats.
making that argument at all. I'm saying that this is a kind of entirely sort of neutral observation.
Well, then why are you making it?
Because I'm talking about the question of political sorting, right? And if you're going to sort of reject the premise that you can be politically sorted, that you've sort of transcended the political binary, I'm saying that no, there's probably
yes.
sort of
politically non-binary
empirical tests that we could apply to sort of see where you would fit.
Yes, but okay.
And that's not again, it's like, it's not a way. I mean, like, but this sort of insecurity is that you're demonstrating right now is, I think, a very classic sort of
perceived insecurity.
It's a classic sort of conservative anxiety of the sort that we were talking about at the very beginning, right? Which is that a lot of conservatives. So conservatism is not terribly popular. I mean, it is popular to some extent. Conservatives can get elected, but it's becoming a smaller segment of the American population. Fewer and fewer Americans are identifying with the Republican Party as their identity than they used to. And
Republican Party or conservatism?
Well, actually,
because I think a lot of
I think you're right about that. Actually, I think that, like, conservatism, I think it's declining, but not as much as you might expect.
I think there's young men, actually, like teenagers and college age men. It's a bounce back to they're identifying more with conservative. You have like all the Andrew Tate, fans and all that nonsense.
Yeah. But right? I mean, one thing that's I can state with complete certainty is that the amount of Americans that identify as Republicans is decreasing. Like, the Republican Party has a brand, and this is why the Republican Party cannot win a presidential election, right? Like, they cannot win the popular vote, and that is a significant sort of impediment to their political fortunes. I mean, they can win in the Electoral College.
Yeah, we'll see in the upcoming election.
That's less than ideal, right? But the point is, let me finish my point.
Yeah,
the point is that if we accept the premise that conservatism is becoming less popular in America overall, the Republican Party is becoming less nationally popular overall. It is much more of a party and an ideology that is popular at a regional level rather than a national level. There's a great deal of states, including many of the largest states, including even, I mean, obviously the Republican Party is very ascendant in this state, but, there's sort of long-term future.
We're in Dallas, Texas. But
there are long-term future projections that sort of make that a little bit of a question mark. But the premise is, if we accept the fact that republicanism is kind of on a little bit of the decrease, then there becomes an incentive for a lot of people that have basically conservative opinions to not identify with a political movement or tribe or identity that most Americans do not like. And so in order to sort of get your opinions to be taken seriously, there becomes an incentive to identify in a different way with different labels and sort of present yourself in a way that will not have people instinctively turned off or, turn off their brains when you start to talk.
That's fair. I believe Bill Maher says something similar about Democrats, where he says that, the D next to people's name is very toxic. I think there's plenty of people who have that same perception about the Democrat Party, how they're out of touch elitists and all that.
No, for sure. Like, and like, you see that a lot, like, in a state like this, right? Like, when you're in a Republican state, or even if you're in a much more Republican state, like, say if you're in Alabama or something, in order for a Democrat to be elected or taken seriously, they have to make a big song and dance about how I'm not a Pelosi Democrat, or I'm not like those Democrats in Washington.
Bernie Sanders Democrat.
Yeah, they have to.
Which, by the way, I like Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, I'm sure you do.
I do. I absolutely. Bernie Sanders he actually is very against a lot of the what you might call woke shit or whatever. And I believe, and I'm pretty left-wing economically, all things considered. But anyway, do you have a final point on that? Because I want to ask you.
No, let's move on.
You think Gavin Newsom's going to run for president?
I think he wants to be president.
Do you think Biden will run in the 2024 election?
Yeah, of course.
You think so? You think he'll make it?
Well, like, there's no reason to believe he wouldn't. I mean,
Come again?
Well, there's no. He's never suggested. He's never even left the door open.
Are there reasons to believe that Joe Biden might not run in 2024?
I don't think there's reasons to believe that he wouldn't run. I think there's a case to be made that he is not the best candidate.
Or that he's not physically capable of running because he's decrepit and has dementia, it appears.
I don't think it appears that he has dementia.
You don't think so?
I think it appears that he's an old man that it's kind of maybe lost a step.
Do you think the criticism of Biden as being too old and not fit to run physically or mentally, do you think that's valid?
I think it's
there's
mostly
validity to that. Or do you think it's mostly right-wing propaganda?
Well, I'll tell you what I think. I mean, the polls suggest that this is a worry that most Americans have. You know, Biden,
Right.
Like when people say, what do you dislike the most about the president? They say age. That's like the number one thing.
Yeah.
And so like,
and he's pretty racist. The
Pardon me?
whole, if you don't vote for me, you're not black. That's not the most
I
progressive.
accept-
Not the most progressive line.
Okay,
he's uttered.
anyway, who cares? I accept the premise that...
Not you, Whitey, but go ahead.
No, but okay. I accept the premise that like most Americans are troubled by Biden's age. I think there's even polls to suggest that this is the number one worry of Democrats. Personally, I feel like a lot of this is just vibes based. Like a lot of people like look at him and they're a
lot of things are just vibes based.
I know.
Life is really just vibes based.
People are weirded out by how old he is, and you know he is the oldest president in American history, and he seems old. Like he seems like an old man. He seems like
acts old.
He acts old,
And not just old is one thing. Decrepit, geriatric.
I don't think he's
unfit for office.
No, because this is the thing, right? So it's like, for example, like when Ronald Reagan was president, like near the end of his presidency, like it's clear that his mind was starting to go a bit. Like he couldn't remember things, and like his own advisors would go on the record saying that, you know, like I have some doubts about the president's sort of mental fitness, or that, you know, he seems, you know, as the Irish would say, like with the fairies sometimes, you know, he repeats himself a lot, he's nodding off, you know, there was like a credible argument to be made, and some of this came up during Iran-Contra and all of that, that, you know, the president's age is impacting his ability to do the job. And I have not seen credible allegations that that's the case with Biden. I've seen credible allegations that Biden seems old and it's kind of cringe and off-putting and weird. But to me, that does not rise to the level of his inability to do the job of president. Do you hear what I'm saying?
I hear what you're saying.
Yes.
I believe that you believe everything that you were saying.
But what is the counter argument to
that? He freezes up like Mitch McConnell does.
But what does that have to do with his ability to do the job of president?
Because being a president might be the most stressful, high stakes, high stress.
No, but that's not what I'm asking. I'm asking like, what is the evidence that Biden's age is impacting his ability to do the job?
I guess I'll have to edit a series of like 6 clips.
No,
I'll take that question and edit 6 different instances of him falling asleep at the podium.
The job,
and then that'll answer that question.
The job of the president of the United States is not to deliver a compelling speech on television. I'm sorry, that is just not his job.
I think we underestimate that might be his most important job, is to be the moral leader, which is arguably.
I mean, that's not in the Constitution. That's not his constitutional responsibility.
A lot of things are not in the Constitution that it should be.
I mean, but I do think that a lot of this is vibe based, and I think that actually, you know, to Biden's credit, like his White House has not been a den of backstabbers the way that almost every other president's administration has been, Republican or Democrat. Traditionally with presidents, you get people who, you know, talk to the media about what a bad guy the president is, or how you don't trust him, or his leadership sucks, and then they write their tell-all books and, you know, give you the inside scoop and all that kind of thing. Like Lord knows Trump had that, but, you know, Reagan had that, and Clinton had that, you know, Carter had that. You know, certainly Nixon had that. Like, there's a long history of presidents sort of being, I don't even want to use a term as sensationalistic as betrayed by their advisors, but certainly, like, I mean, even in Canada, like, people have gone on the record, like, former cabinet ministers who used to work under Trudeau have gone to the press and say, like, I have serious concerns about the way that this administration is leading, blah, 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 blah. Biden, as far as I know, Biden still has all of his original cabinet ministers. Like, no one has come out against him. No one has questioned his competence publicly. You know, I don't even think, like, he's been a remarkably sort of unifying figure within his own government. And that's not nothing.
He's a unifying figure amongst the people who already agree with him. I'm just kidding.
Yes,
that's unusual.
That's
fair enough.
That's not nothing.
Fair enough.
I mean, half the people that ever
question the degree to which the progressive wing of the Democratic Party is a big fan of Biden, but there certainly are a lot of
I mean,
who are
when
ostensibly very progressive.
when
who are fans of
Destiny
Biden.
and Vosh and them were in Washington D.C. the other day,
They're very pro-Biden. That was exactly
well, I
what
mean,
I was
that's the
thinking of.
thing, right? It's like a lot of progressives have had to sort of concede a point that their base doesn't want to hear, because a lot of sort of the progressive sort of social media, audience, they just want to hear how the Democrats are a bunch of sellouts and they've never done anything progressive and they're, indistinguishable from the corporate Republicans and blah, 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 blah. But now when you have, you have people like Vosh and Destiny, when they're put on the spot, they have to sort of concede that actually, well, Biden's done a lot of progressive things and he's been a surprisingly good president. Like, that's a line that you hear a lot from the left wingers these days. And that's again, that suggests that, you can like or hate his political agenda, but in terms of his ability to do the job, there's not, I think, a lot of evidence to suggest that he's deficient.
So says JJ McCullough. We've got, I think, maybe a few minutes. I think we started a little bit after 5. So, do you have anything you would like to bring up or end on?
Nothing that I think we can. Well,
we can't save for next time.
Well, let's just talk about like where we think the race stands right now. What is your sort of feeling of the race? Well, tell me about
the whites have colonized a lot of. Oh, you mean the political race?
Tell me. So like the Republicans have been having these debates. Do you think that these matter at all?
No, Trump is going to be the nominee.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's actually somewhat preposterous that the press even continues to hold these debates. It just seems like such a waste of everyone's time and money.
Well, I'm sure it brings in viewers.
Do you think it does? Like, who's the audience for
I don't know.
things?
Maybe I think there was a good amount on Rumble. I don't know. Maybe it's not the juice is not worth the squeeze. I actually think it's a VP selection thing. You think Trump will pick Nikki Haley?
Trump has said he's not going to pick any of these people to be his VP.
Well, Trump said he'd build a wall in Mexico. We'll pay for it.
Yeah, it's true. Trump does say lots of things. I don't think Trump.
I don't like Nikki Haley. I think she's too neocon shill. But I think she actually would have a better chance of beating Biden than Trump. Maybe. I don't know. Actually, I don't.
She absolutely would.
I don't know.
I think almost anyone could.
I think she'd be a good VP pick for Trump.
I think almost any of those guys on the stage could beat Biden, except for DeSantis and probably Ramaswamy.
Yeah, DeSantis. It's funny. You sent me a tweet some time ago where DeSantis attacked Trump for holding up a pride flag, and I was like, I thought the whole advantage DeSantis was going to have was that he would be, more moderate to Trump, but it was the opposite. He just took the whole
if DeSantis had just like
woke thing, which is like, I have no problem being labeled anti-woke, but
yes. If DeSantis had just shut his
traditional pride flag, the regular rainbow, that's tradition. Embrace tradition, reject modernity, right? Reject the new flag with the 7 triangles and all that. Embrace tradition.
Yeah, is your next take going to be like,
that's centrism,
there's too many letters in the LGBT thing these days? Okay, Grandpa, let's get you to bed.
All right. Okay.
But no, what I was going to say is that
I'm gonna let you cook in your own grease.
But no, okay? I'm going to say I've said like I agree with you though about DeSantis, right? Like if DeSantis had just shut his mouth and said nothing and run just a relative because DeSantis is very conservative and he has a very conservative record in Florida. But he reads, or at least he used to, he read as a kind of like more normal, safe, sane kind of Republican, which I think was his biggest advantage. And for some reason, the Silicon Valley freakazoids who are running his campaign told him to lean super hard into these aggressive culture war things and make these like real cringe advertisements where he's like, I'm the Chad and, I'm like, what's his face from American Psycho? You saw those ads, one of which was made by like some sort of neo-Nazi kid who then had to like resign.
Oh, I know. I think I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, where he's walking into the Nazi sun and all this kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
But no, it's like, but anyway, yeah, I think Biden is very vulnerable, but I think that the Republicans are in love with Trump, who is the man who lost to him last time.
Yep.
So strategically, it's a very inexplicable decision. But, Biden's got his deficiencies as well. But how about this one, though? Your buddy, RFK Jr.,
my buddy,
says that he's going to run as an independent candidate. He's going to give up the Democrat thing, which I think makes sense because it was very clear that he was not getting any traction in that party.
He was like 20% at one point.
Well, that still means that 80% don't want him.
Well, I think the DNC should just host a debate.
I mean,
I know incumbents, actually, they don't know, they don't. There's a valid argument for why that shouldn't be, but it's just like, to me, that's what I've got
a good question for you. Do you think that, because I've heard some chatter about this, do you think that either Trump or Biden has any strategic incentive in having a debate one-on-one?
I think Trump does. I think Trump compared to Biden in Biden's current state
But Trump is
will
not
win.
attractive.
Trump lost a couple debates against Biden the first time, but that was all because Trump went way too hard.
But
and,
that's
went
the
after
thing,
his
right?
son.
Like that's the thing.
But by the last debate,
yeah,
Trump was. Someone had explicitly told him, like, dude, you're going way too fucking hard.
Yeah.
And he had reeled it back, and that was a debate he won, according to whatever.
Yeah. But the question is,
and if he came out with that and just sat there and said,
yeah.
look, I'm not going to insult my opponent for being too old. That's
But see, like, I mean, I agree. I think there's truth to that analysis. But the question is, we're now 4 years later.
All of my analyses.
We're 4 years later, and is Trump more disciplined now than he was 4 years ago? Is Trump going to do a better performance?
We'll see. We got to end it here.
All right, that's fine.
So wait,
hold
on. What I was going to say is, I would consider voting for Gavin Newsom over Donald Trump if it was Newsom versus Trump. If it's Biden versus Trump, I'm either sitting that one out or voting for Trump because I do not trust Biden.
You might be
that can be the topic of our next conversation.
You might be the only American with that position.
The only enlightened centrist. All right. Well, hey, thank you, everyone. That is it for us today, and we'll. What? There's no words on it. To play us out, what does that mean? To end the show? Okay. That is it for us today, and we'll leave you with a... You know what? I can't do it. We'll do it live. We'll do it live. Fuck it. We'll do it live. There's no words on it. Play us out. Fucking thing sucks.
Oh, bravo.
All right. Thank you, Spider.